I have been a keeper of records for 31 years, and in all that time, I have never filed a document that frightened me. I am frightened now. Let me begin at the beginning, which is the only way I know how to begin. I am Orath Vel, Senior Curator of the Occupation Annexes, Conclave of Binding Records, third tier of the Administrative Remembrance. My division holds the files no one requests, not because they are sealed, though some are, but because the species and polities whose histories fill those shelves are no longer present to request them. When the last administrator of a failed occupation finally closes the transit manifest and files the withdrawal notice, the paperwork lands on my desk. I stamp it. I archive it. I add the final entry to the annex record and move on to the next. I have done this 18 times. I want to be precise about that number, because precision is what I was trained for, and because I believe the number matters in a way I could not have articulated before today. 18 polities, 18 sets of administrative files, 18 withdrawal notices, each one written in the particular bureaucratic register of a species that did not want to describe what actually happened. 18 records that end not in battle orders or surrender protocols or negotiated withdrawals, but in a silence that came on slowly, like a tide going out that never came back. The conclave has a word for this category of file. We call it a concluded annex. Concluded, not failed. The distinction was important to someone once. I have come to believe the distinction is a lie the conclave tells itself, but I am an archivist, not a philosopher, and it is not my place to say so in the official record. It is, however, my place to say so here. I am recording this from inside the prefect's hall of Vethanu Station, on the third human-adjacent world of the Doravan Fringe, in what was once the administrative heart of the Doravan Compact's occupation of this sector. The compact was the 14th of the 18. They arrived under treaty, a negotiated access agreement that the humans signed without apparent reluctance, which was the first thing that should have worried everyone, though no one noted it in the file at the time. They established administrative offices on 6 worlds. They posted garrison units on 4. They filed quarterly reports for 43 years, every one of them technically in order, every one of them written in the flat, procedural language of an administration that believed itself to be functioning normally. Then the report stopped. Not all at once. The compact did not collapse on a single day. The reports from the outer posts stopped first, then the mid-tier administrative stations. Then, after an interval of roughly 11 years, the reports from this world from Vethanu Station itself, the seat of the compact's authority in human-adjacent space, simply ceased. The last report on file is a routine quarterly summary, filed on schedule, noting no irregularities. The administrator on record was a Doravan senior prefect named Keelith Asu, whose signature appears clean and untroubled at the bottom of the page. Keelith Asu has not been heard from since. Neither has the Doravan Compact as a polity. They exist today as a diaspora, scattered remnant populations on 3 worlds outside human space, the survivors of the withdrawal that never officially happened because no one was left to file the paperwork. I filed it for them. That is the kind of thing the Occupation Annexes Division does. We close the records for polities that no longer can. My supervisor, former supervisor, she retired 4 years ago to a seaside estate on Vareth Prime, and has not, to my knowledge, lost any sleep over the matter. Told me once that the key skill of an Occupation Annexes curator was learning to read the silences. Not the words in the files, she said, but the shape of the absence after the words end. Every concluded annex has a different silence, she told me, and each one tells you something about how the occupation ended, even when the records don't. I believed her at the time. I believe her more now, standing in this hall, in a silence so complete I can hear the particulate settling through the shafts of dim light from what used to be the prefect's viewing ports. I need to explain why I am here, because it is not a normal thing for an Occupation Annexes curator to do. We are, by the nature of our work, archivists of the concluded. We work with what is already finished. We do not go out into the field. The field, in our case, is not a place that invites visiting. The field, in our case, is human space. There is a standing protocol at the conclave. It has been standing for a very long time, long enough that no one in my division remembers when it was written, or why the specific language was chosen. That states, in plain administrative prose, that no conclave officer is authorized to enter human-adjacent space for the purpose of records retrieval without a formal transit clearance from the Human Boundary Commission, a monitored escort from the Commission's designated observer corps, and a written risk acknowledgement signed by the curator's divisional director and at least 2 members of the conclave's executive board. The protocol is long. It is detailed. It uses the word monitored 7 times in 4 pages, which is the kind of thing I notice because I have read a great many protocols. I obtained all of the required clearances. This is important. I want the record to reflect that I followed procedure. The transit clearance is logged. The observer escort is present. 2 commission officers are waiting outside this building in a sealed shuttle, monitoring my audio feed and ready to extract me on a 30-second notice. The risk acknowledgement was signed by my divisional director with what I interpreted as unusual speed, which I chose not to think about too carefully. I am here because of a simple administrative problem. The Dorovan Compact's concluded annex is the only one of the 18 that is technically incomplete. 17 of the 18 annexes were closed with a final status certification, a document confirming that all accessible records had been collected, cataloged, and sealed. 17 have that certification in the file. The Dorovan file does not, because the Dorovan file includes a reference, in a footnote to a secondary administrative report, filed in the 39th year of the occupation, to a physical records room here at Vethanu Station, a sealed chamber at the station's lowest level, described in the footnote as containing prefect-level correspondence not duplicated in the transmission record. For the purposes of the conclave standards, an annex that references an uncollected physical record cannot be certified as complete. It has sat in that state for 112 years. I am the first curator in those 112 years who has elected to close it properly, which means I am the first to request transit clearance for this purpose, which means I am currently standing in a building that no non-human presence has occupied in 112 years, and I find that the silence in here is not the kind I was trained to read. I want to talk about the 18 before I go to the lower level. I want to talk about them because I have spent 31 years with their files, and I have never spoken about them in a context that wasn't purely procedural. And I think that this record, which I am making for myself as much as for the conclave, should contain some account of what the files actually show. The first occupation on record, Annex 1, was the Thirving Consolidation. They preceded the formation of the conclave by several hundred years. Their records are fragmentary. We have them partly because a Thirving historian compiled them generations after the consolidation's dissolution, partly because certain other species maintained diplomatic contact with them long enough to preserve correspondence. The Thirving entered what they called the uncharted interior, what we now know as the inner human-settled worlds, without resistance. The human populations they encountered did not fight them. The Thirving records describe this with considerable satisfaction, noting that the local populations were compliant and tractable, and that administrative control was established with minimal friction. The Thirving consolidation lasted 31 years in the uncharted interior before its administrators began to file reports describing what they called environmental difficulties. The reports are vague in a way that reads, to a trained archivist, as deliberate: environmental difficulties, logistical complications, personnel transitions. The language of an administration that could not name what was happening to it without admitting that it did not understand what was happening to it. I have read those reports many times. They are among the most studied documents in my division, not because anyone ever acts on their findings, but because they were the first of their kind, the original shape of a silence that would repeat itself 17 more times. And what strikes me about them, every time, is not the vagueness. The vagueness is expected. What strikes me is the pace of the vagueness, the rate at which the reports slowly shift from a confident administrative voice to something quieter, something more provisional, as if the administrators were not just failing to find the right words but were losing their certainty about whether words applied to what they were observing. The last Thurving report from the Interior is a single paragraph. It lists the names of the 7 remaining administrative posts that were still operational at the time of writing. It notes that all supply runs had been suspended pending a review. It says nothing else. The Thurving consolidation withdrew from the uncharted Interior 4 years after that paragraph was written, by which point, according to their own records, roughly 60% of the administrative personnel who had served in the Interior over the 31-year period were unaccounted for. Not dead, not captured, unaccounted for. There is a difference, though the difference is one the Thurving records never clarify. I have raised this point with the Conclave's analytical division twice in my career, both times in writing, and both times received responses that acknowledged my concern, while declining to add it to any active inquiry file. I have thought about that unclarity for 31 years. Before the Kelvari, there was the Menvath sovereignty, the second occupation on record. The Menvath came in with a larger administrative footprint than the Thurving and a more systematic approach. They did not merely establish posts but mapped, catalogued, and classified the human-settled worlds they entered with the thoroughness of a species that believed knowledge was the foundation of administration. Their survey teams produced extraordinary work. The maps are still in our archive, 400 years later, and they remain among the most precise cartographic records of the inner human-settled worlds we possess. The Menvath knew, in the technical sense, every world they occupied, its geography, its population density, its resource profile, its seasonal patterns. They knew where the people lived. They knew how many there were. They filed this knowledge in exhaustive detail across a 22-year administrative tenure. None of that knowledge told them what was happening to them. The Menvath records are distinguished, in my reading of them, by the quality of their confusion. They are not vague in the way the Thurving were vague. The Menvath named things, catalogued things, were constitutionally unable to leave an observation without a category. What makes their records distinctive is that, by the 15th year, the categories had stopped working. The catalog entries for the human populations begin to accumulate footnotes. The footnotes are attempts to account for observations that do not fit the primary categories, and the footnotes have their own footnotes. And by the 19th year, the main entries are brief, and the footnotes go on for pages, each one describing, with the meticulous frustration of a very precise mind confronting something that will not resolve into precision, a quality of the human-settled worlds that the Menvath could observe but could not classify. They called it substrate coherence, which is not a real term, but was their attempt to name what they were observing. A quality of the human populations and the human-settled worlds together, a kind of alignment between the people and the places they inhabited, that read to Menvath instruments as a structural property of the territory rather than a characteristic of its inhabitants. As if the people had become, over a very long time, indistinguishable from the landscape in some way that was below the resolution of their administrative categories. The Menvath sovereignty withdrew in its 22nd year and dissolved as a polity 40 years after that. In the final paragraph of their last report from the Interior, their senior administrator wrote, "We have spent 22 years cataloging this territory, and we understand it less than we did when we arrived." The second occupation, the Kelvari expansion, lasted 27 years. The Kelvari were a careful, methodical species. They approached administration the way a cartographer approaches terrain that has not been reliably surveyed, with instruments and protocols and a commendable awareness that the existing maps might be wrong. They came into human space knowing what had happened to the Thurving, which was more than most of the 18 can say, and they adjusted their approach accordingly. No garrisons. Civilian administrators only. A policy of engagement with local populations rather than removal. They believed, and their early reports suggest they had reason to believe, that this approach was working. Their personnel returns for the first 15 years show low attrition. Their population engagement metrics, a category the Thurving never developed, show gradually increasing frequency of formal contact with the human populations they were administering. Then the contact frequency began to decline. Not sharply, not dramatically. The Calvari records show a slow reduction in the metrics over the next 8 years, accompanied by reports that explain the reduction with admirable consistency. The local populations had seasonal patterns that affected social contact, the administrators noted. The local populations had customs around formal engagement that required adjustment in their approach. The local populations were the word that appears across a dozen different reports, in a dozen different phrasings, reorienting their relationship to the administrative structure. The word appears so often that I once flagged it for the analytical division. Reorienting. What the Calvari administrators meant by it, when pressed in their private correspondence, appears to be something like, the populations are still present, still functional, still in all observable ways continuing their lives exactly as before. They are simply becoming, very gradually, less legible to our administrative categories. Not hostile, not invisible. Legible in the way that a landscape is legible, present, comprehensible in its parts, but ceasing to be legible in the specific way that a governed population is legible to its governors. The Calvari expansion ended its administration on the 47-year anniversary of its arrival, with a final report that is unlike any of the other 17 final reports in the collection. It is not a single paragraph. It is a 12-page document, carefully argued, precisely cited, in the formal style of a species that maintained its procedural rigor until the end. Its conclusion, stated in the final 2 paragraphs, in language I have memorized because I have read it perhaps 400 times, is as follows. This administration closes its formal administrative record not in failure and not under compulsion. We close it because we have reached the conclusion, after careful review, that the populations under our administrative jurisdiction are not, in any functional sense, under our administrative jurisdiction. We have administered this territory for 47 years. During that time, we have filed complete and accurate reports. We have maintained our posts. We have kept our personnel safe and their conduct professional. We have done everything an administration does. We have not governed. Governance requires a governed party, and the populations here have never been a governed party. They have been themselves, entirely, throughout the tenure of our administration, and they will continue to be themselves after our departure. And this record reflects our acknowledgement that the difference between the presence and the absence of our administration in this place is, from their perspective, precisely nothing. The last line of that document reads, "We recommend against future attempts." 14 administrations came after them. The second occupation, the Calvari, lasted 27 years. The third, the Asenmir Directorate, lasted 39. The fourth, fifth, and sixth varied between 19 and 44 years. The pattern is consistent enough that I once charted it, not for any official purpose, just for myself, because I'm the kind of archivist who charts things, and found that the average tenure of an occupation presence inside human-adjacent space. Across all 18 attempts spanning roughly 800 years of recorded history, was 33 years and 4 months. 33 years and 4 months, then silence. I want to be very clear about what that silence is and is not. It is not a record of battle. None of the 18 annexes contain a record of a pitched engagement with human forces. Some contain records of individual incidents, a garrison unit that stopped communicating, a patrol vessel that did not return to its station, a supply convoy that arrived at its destination to find the receiving outpost empty. Individual incidents, logged as anomalies, each one small enough to be explained away. No invasion, no fleet action, no moment that could be pointed to as the turn, just the slow accumulation of small endings spread over years until the administration that had come to occupy a world found that there was nothing left of itself to do the occupying. Several of the later annexes, the ones from polities that came after the Calvari, after the recommendation against future attempts, contain explicit references to the Calvari report. They cite it in their initial feasibility assessments. They argue against it. They provide reasons why their situation differs, why their approach will succeed where the Calvari's careful methods failed, why the populations in their particular sector of human space are less settled, less established, more susceptible to successful administration. The Vorath Protectorate, the ninth of the 18, cited the Calvari report directly in their opening administrative charter and refuted each of its conclusions in a 60-page annex of their own. The Vorath Protectorate lasted 28 years. Their final report, filed by a single administrator working alone in an outpost that had once housed 40, is one paragraph long. It lists the names of 3 supply depots that were still operational at the time of writing. It does not explain where the other 39 administrators went. I stand in the prefect's hall of Vethanu Station, and I look at the empty shelving alcoves, and I think about the 17 reports whose final paragraphs I know the way a musician knows a piece they have played for 30 years, by hand, by weight, by the specific quality of the silence that follows the last note. The Conclave's analytical division has reviewed the occupation annexes 3 times in the last 2 centuries, each time seeking a pattern that might explain the consistent outcome. The first review concluded that the occupied worlds had logistical profiles that made long-term administration economically unviable. The second review concluded that the human populations, while not overtly resistant, employed forms of passive noncompliance that made governance structurally unstable. The third review concluded that further analysis was warranted. The third review's final report has sat in my filing cabinet for 11 years, waiting for further analysis that no one has requested. I have my own conclusion. I have had it for some time, and I have never written it into any official document, because it is not the kind of conclusion that official documents are meant to contain. But I am going to write it into this one, because I am standing in the ruins of the 14th occupation, and I think that the act of being here has earned me the right to say it plainly. The 18 occupations did not fail because of logistics or noncompliance or structural instability. They failed because the act of occupying human space invites something that cannot be occupied, cannot be administered, and does not negotiate. I do not know if that something is the humans themselves, some quality of them, some faculty that operates below the level of declared resistance, or if it is something else, something that was here before the humans were or that the humans carry with them without knowing it. I do not know. The files don't say. The files never say. That is the shape of the silence I mentioned. The thing that the silence is the shape of is the thing that ended 33 years of administration, 18 times, without ever appearing in a report. I need to go to the lower level now. The prefect's hall is larger than I expected. The Dorovan compact built in a style I can only describe as aspirational, high ceilings, wide corridors, the kind of architectural confidence that says we intend to be here for a long time. The viewing ports, designed to admit a quality of light that Dorovan physiology requires, have clouded over with mineral deposit from more than a century of disuse, but they still admit a pale, diffuse glow that makes the space look less abandoned than it is. The furniture is gone. The compact took what was portable when they withdrew. What remains is the fixed infrastructure, the floor, the walls, the ceiling, the conduit channels built into the stone, the shelving alcoves that once held administrative files and are now empty. The emptiness has a texture to it. That is the only way I can describe it. I have been in abandoned buildings before. The Conclave maintains several sites on worlds where concluded polities once operated, and occasional administrative visits are routine, and those buildings feel empty in the straightforward sense of lacking inhabitants. This building feels empty in a different register. It feels like a space from which something was subtracted rather than a space from which something merely left. As if the inhabitants took something with them that was not inventory, something that was a property of the space itself rather than of the furnishings, and they removed it when they withdrew, and it has not been here in the 112 years since. I am noting this in the record because I want to be precise, and because precision requires me to report what I observe rather than what I expected to observe. The corridor to the lower level is on the building's north face. The footnote in the secondary report described it as a sealed service passage that predated the compact's occupation, which means the compact used existing infrastructure rather than constructing their own records room. The humans who built Vethanu Station originally built a lower level. The compact moved into it. I want to stop here and note something about that, because I have been thinking about it since I arrived. The Doravan Compact built extensively on this world. They were an ambitious administration, as occupations went. The archaeological record of their presence here includes more than 40 structures across the six-world territory, most of them purpose-built for compact administrative functions. They brought their own architects. They brought their own engineers. They built what they needed where they needed it. They did not build their sealed records room. They used the one that was already here. The footnote says this without apparent awareness that it is notable. Prefect-level correspondence housed in the pre-existing subsurface facility. That is the full text of the footnote, filed as a routine administrative notation in the 39th year of the occupation, 4 years before the report stopped. I have read that footnote many times, and every time I read it I think about what it means that the compact, with all its architects and engineers, chose not to build its own secure record storage, and instead moved its most sensitive documents into a facility that was already underground, already sealed, already here when they arrived. I thought about it on the journey here. I think about it now, standing at the top of the descending passage, looking down into the biolume light that the Commission Observer team installed during their initial survey 3 days ago. The passage descends at a gentle angle for approximately 40 meters, then levels out into a short antechamber, then opens into the records room. The Commission team surveyed it, photographed it, confirmed the presence of the compact's archived materials, and withdrew. Their report is in my file. It is, in the professional language of field survey work, scrupulously neutral. It describes what they found without once speculating on what they felt while they were finding it. I read it 3 times on the journey here. I noted that it was unusually short for a survey of its scope. I begin the descent. The passage walls are stone, the same pre-compact construction material visible everywhere in the lower register of this building. Whatever the humans built their foundations from, dense and dark, and faintly warm in a way that stone that has been underground for a long time usually is not. The biolume units cast their steady light, and the passage is adequate to navigate, and I am walking at what I would describe as a deliberate pace, by which I mean a pace that is not quite normal, but is not yet the pace of someone who has decided to turn around. I am aware of something. Not yet, or rather, I notice the absence of something I expected to feel. I expected, standing at the top of this passage, to feel the particular variety of unease that comes from entering a confined and unfamiliar space on a world that has not been visited for a long time. That unease would be normal. It would be rational. It would not require any explanation beyond the circumstances. What I feel instead is quieter, more specific. It is less like unease and more like attention, as if the passage is attending to my presence the way a room attends to a sound that carries in it, not threatening, not welcoming, simply registering, nodding in some quality of the air or the stone or the light that there is now something here that was not here before. I keep walking. The antechamber has a door. It is not the compact's door. The compact's door was a standard administrative security panel, bio-keyed and code-locked, and it is still in its frame, but it stands open, the locking mechanism disengaged from the outside at some point between the last report and now. The Commission survey noted this in their preliminary assessment. Access panel found in the disengaged position, consistent with manual override during an orderly withdrawal. Consistent with. That is the language of an assessment that does not want to say what it actually found. Behind the compact's door is another door, older, stone or something that presents as stone. The surface has a quality I associate with very old construction, the kind that predates the materials engineering that made the compact's building possible. There are markings on it, not Dorovan, not any script I recognize from the annex files or from any file the Conclave's archive holds. I reviewed photographs of these markings before this visit. In the photographs, they read as abstract. In person, standing 2 meters from the door, they read as something else. I lack the precise vocabulary for what they read as in person. My training is in administrative records, not in symbolic analysis or archaeological interpretation. I will say only that standing in front of them produces a sensation I do not have a clinical term for and will describe, inadequately, as recognition. The sense that whatever system of meaning these markings belong to, some part of my cognition is responding to it as if it has encountered it before, in a context I cannot access directly. This door, unlike the compact's door, is closed. I am noting the time, mid-afternoon, local solar. Commission Observer Escort is monitoring my audio feed. I am going to attempt to open the door and enter the records room. The door opens inward. It is not locked. It moves on a pivot mechanism that shows no resistance whatsoever, despite its evident age, which is the kind of maintenance that does not happen in abandoned buildings, and I am choosing not to interpret that. The room beyond is smaller than I expected, perhaps 8 meters by 6, ceiling lower than the corridor. The Commission biolume units were placed inside, and they are functioning, which means I can see the room clearly. The compact's records are here, or rather, what remains of them is here. The physical media data cores, document folio casings, the archive tablets that Dorovan administrative stations used for their most sensitive correspondence, are arranged on shelving along the eastern and western walls. They are intact. The Commission survey confirmed they are intact. 43 years of prefect-level correspondence, the files that were never duplicated in the transmission record, sitting in a sealed room in a building that has been unoccupied for 112 years. I will be taking those with me when I leave. They are the reason I am here. They will complete the annex file. I will catalog them, submit the certification, and close the Dorovan record, and the only open file in the occupation annexes will finally be shut. But that is not what I am looking at. The south wall has no shelving. The south wall is bare stone, the same pre-compact construction material as the door, and it runs floor to ceiling without any compact modification. The compact, which modified and built over everything else in this building, left the south wall alone. The south wall has writing on it. Not the markings from the door. This is writing, or at least it presents as writing in a way the markings do not. It is in Dorovan administrative script, which I read fluently as a requirement of my position. It is hand-inscribed directly onto the stone, with something that scratched the surface deeply enough that the characters are still fully legible after more than a century. They are not neat, they have the quality of something written in haste, or in strong feeling, or both, but they are legible. Every word is legible. I am going to read them into the record. I need a moment first. I want to be precise about what I am about to say, and precision in this case means acknowledging that what I am reading on this wall is a personal document, not an official one. It is not a report, not a filing, not a formatted administrative record. It is the last communication of Keyleth Asu, senior prefect of the Doravan Compact's 6th Administrative Zone, written on the wall of a records room in the basement of a building she ran for 43 years, and it was not written for the conclave. It was not written for the transmission record. It was not written to be found by an archivist 112 years later. I believe it was written to be found by whoever came next. I have been an archivist for 31 years, and in all that time I have never encountered a document that seemed to know I was coming. I encounter one now. The inscription begins with the date, 43rd year of the Compact's administrative tenure on this world, 42 days after the last quarterly report was filed. Then, I am Keyleth Asu, and I am the last administrator in this building. The withdrawal is complete. My staff departed on the last transport 3 days ago, and I have remained to close the physical record. I want to say this clearly so that whoever finds this document understands it. The withdrawal is not a defeat. We were not driven out. We were not threatened or attacked. Every member of my staff boarded their transport willingly. I watched them go. What happened to this administration was not something that can be named as a military or political failure, and I will not have it named that way in my personal record. What happened to this administration was that we became unnecessary. I want to be careful about this word because I have spent 20 years inside this system that I did not build, and I understand what it is now in a way that I did not understand when I arrived. The humans who built this station, who built this room, they left it here. I want you to understand what I mean when I say they left it here. They left it for the next people who would need a sealed room. They knew there would be next people. They knew those people would arrive and administer and eventually leave, and they built this room for all of them. I have spent 20 years believing that we were governing this world. I understand now that we were being accommodated. The humans have not been visible on this world during the term of our administration. I do not mean absent. The population is here, in the cities and the agricultural zones and the outer settlements that predate our arrival by centuries. I mean not visible in the administrative sense. They never appeared at our offices. They never filed appeals or petitions. They never engaged with our governance structure in any capacity. For the first 5 years, I interpreted this as disengagement or passive resistance, and I wrote reports accordingly. By the 15th year, I had stopped writing reports about it because I had nothing new to say. By the 30th year, I had stopped thinking about it in terms of resistance at all. They were not resisting. That is not the correct frame. The correct frame is that our governance structure was a structure they had no need for, and they had no need for it because they had their own structure, one that I never succeeded in fully observing and do not claim to understand, that operated continuously beneath and around our administrative presence for the entire duration of the occupation. My staff did not leave because they were frightened or coerced. They left because, one by one, over the last 8 years, they came to understand what I came to understand, that there was nothing for them to govern, that the administration we were maintaining was a performance for our own benefit, not a functional exercise of authority. The paperwork was real. The filing was real. The reports were real. The authority was not. The authority was never real, not from the first day we set foot here. And the humans permitted us our paperwork because the paperwork was not, in any meaningful sense, a threat to them. I do not say this with bitterness. I want to be clear about that. I say it as an observation and as a kind of accounting. We came here believing we were claiming something. We leave understanding that nothing here was ever ours to claim, and that the humans knew this before we arrived, and that they waited with a patience I do not have a word for in my language until we finished claiming it. There is a quality to the humans that I spent 20 years trying to categorize and never could. It is not a military quality, though they are capable fighters. We knew this before we came, and I would not have taken this post if I thought we were walking into a war, and I was right. We were not. It is not a cultural quality in the sense of customs or traditions or social structures, though they have all of those. It is something underneath those things, something that I can only describe by its effects, which are as follows. Every person who served under my administration in this sector, without exception, eventually reached a point at which they understood, on some level they could not entirely articulate, that they were guests. Not unwelcome guests. That is the critical distinction. We were not unwelcome. The humans on this world treated my staff with courtesy in the limited interactions we had. They shared food with us during the early years, invited our administrative officers to local observances, tolerated our presence in the market districts of their cities with a patience that I initially read as submission and later understood was something entirely different. They were not hostile. They were, in the precise meaning of the word, gracious. They were gracious in the way that a very old, very settled creature is gracious towards something small and temporary that has wandered into its territory. Not threatening it, not particularly interested in it, waiting for it with the patience of something that has seen this kind of small and temporary thing many times before, to finish and leave. I have spent the last 2 years of this administration reviewing the records of every occupation that preceded ours. I had access to 7 of the preceding 13 in the Compact's own archive system. The conclave shares certain concluded annex materials with polities that may themselves become relevant to those records. Reading them, I found the same thing in all 7. The same arc. The confident early reports. The gradual shift in administrative register. The slow realization, documented without being named, that the governance structure was performing for an audience of one. The quiet personnel transitions as staff, one by one, arrived at the conclusion and requested reassignment. The final skeleton of administrators keeping the paperwork alive out of institutional inertia, or perhaps out of the hope that they were wrong, until even that gave way. The thing that I understand now, that the records of those 7 earlier occupations do not say explicitly, but that I can read in the accumulated weight of their silences, is this. The humans did not resist us. They did not need to resist us. They let us administer our administration for as long as we needed to administer it, and then the administration was over, not because they ended it, but because it arrived, by its own internal logic, at the point where it had exhausted itself. We ran out of things to govern. We ran out of reasons to be here. We ran out of the administrative will that had carried us this far, and when we ran out, there was nothing underneath it to replace it, because there never had been anything underneath it except the belief that we were where we were supposed to be. The humans always knew we were not where we were supposed to be. They were kind enough not to say so. There is one more thing I want to record before I close the physical file and leave. There is something in this room that was here before the Compact arrived and before every administration before us. I do not know what it is. I have spent 20 years in this building, and I have been in this room perhaps a dozen times, and every time I have been in this room I have been aware of it, not seen it, not heard it. Aware of it in the way that you are aware of being observed, except that the observation carries no hostility and no judgment and no particular interest in your presence, only an awareness of you that is as steady and patient and old as anything I have ever felt in my life. The humans know it is here. Of this I am certain. Whether it is something they brought or something they found or something that found them, I cannot say. Whether it is the reason no occupation has lasted or merely a companion to the reason, I cannot say. I can say only that it was here before us, and it is here now, and it will be here after you read this, and it has been aware of you since you came down the corridor, and it is not angry, and it is not threatening you, and you should go now. I stand in the records room for a long time after I finish reading. The commission observer's voice comes through my earpiece, steady and professional, asking if I am all right. I tell them I am. I tell them I am completing the physical record retrieval and will return to the shuttle within 20 minutes. This is true. I am completing the physical record retrieval. I am carefully removing the data cores and the folio casings from the shelving and placing them in the transport cases I brought for this purpose, working methodically, following the retrieval protocol that I have followed dozens of times in my career. My hands are steady. My movements are efficient. The archivist's habit of the body, which does not require the archivist's mind to be fully present. My mind is on the awareness. I have been aware of it since I reached the bottom of the corridor. Not since I entered the room, since the corridor. Since before I opened the stone door. Since, I think, some point during the descent that I could not have named precisely, as if a threshold had been crossed that had nothing to do with the doors or the distance. It is exactly as Keyleth Asu described it. A steady, patient, ancient awareness trained on me with no hostility and no particular interest. The way a continent is aware of the rain that falls on it. The rain is present. The continent registers it. The continent does not alter its character on account of it, and when the rain ends, the continent continues. That is the closest I can come to a description, and it is inadequate. And Keyleth Asu spent 20 years trying to describe it, and arrived at language no more precise than mine. I finish packing the transport cases. I take one photograph of the wall inscription, for the record. The commission survey already photographed it, but I want my own, in the specific quality of light that exists in this moment, in this room, and I stand for a moment in the doorway before I leave. The room does not look different than it did when I entered. The shelving is empty now. The compact's records are in my cases. Keyleth Asu's inscription is on the south wall. The biolume units cast their even, adequate light over everything. Nothing in the room has moved. Nothing in the room has changed. The awareness has not intensified or diminished. I think about the 18. I think about 33 years and 4 months, the average tenure, the number I charted for myself in a quiet afternoon at my desk long ago. I think about the Thurvan 60% unaccounted for, not dead, not captured, unaccounted for. And I think about the Calvari's careful 12 pages concluding that the difference between their presence and their absence was, from the perspective of the people they were governing, precisely nothing. I think about the 17 other records that end in a silence whose shape I have spent a career trying to read. I think about Keyleth Asu writing on a stone wall in 43-year-old administrative script. You should go now. I go. The walk up the corridor takes approximately 4 minutes. I carry the transport cases in both hands and I look straight ahead and I note, in the part of my mind that is always noting things, that the awareness does not follow me up the corridor. It does not diminish as I ascend. It is present everywhere I am present in this building, like a quality of the stone itself, but it does not press. It does not urge. It simply continues to register my presence, as it registered Keyleth Asu, as it registered every administrative officer who descended this corridor during the compact's 43 years. As it registered, I now understand, every officer of every other occupation who was ever in a room like this one, on a world like this one. Before the record stopped, and the polity dissolved, and another concluded annex arrived on my desk. As I reach the top of the corridor, the awareness does something I had not anticipated. It changes, not in intensity, in quality. What was a neutral registration becomes, very briefly, so briefly that I would not log it in an official report because I cannot be certain it was not my own mind supplying something the situation suggested, something warmer, not welcoming, not threatening, something older than both of those. The closest word I have is acknowledged. I cross the prefect's hall without stopping and walk out into the pale afternoon light of a world that has hosted 14 administrations, and absorbed each of them with the patience of something that does not experience time the way administrations do. The commission observers are waiting by the shuttle. They look at me, the way professional people look at a colleague who has just come out of a situation that the briefing notes described as low risk, and that both parties now understand to have been something else. We do not discuss it. We load the transport cases. We run the departure checklist. Before I enter the shuttle, I turn and look at Vethanu Station one more time. The high walls, the clouded viewing ports, the aspirational architecture of an administration that is now a footnote in a file that only I read. 112 years of stillness in the afternoon light. I think about what Keyleth Asu wrote, "We were accommodated." I think about the 7 earlier records I have not yet mentioned in this dictation, the 8th through the 13th occupations, the ones that came after the Kalvari's explicit recommendation against future attempts and before the Doravan Compact, the Asanmir Directorate, the Vorath Protectorate, the Selvin Administrative Reach, and the 3 polities that came in the long generation between the Selvin's dissolution and the Compact's treaty, all of them arriving with reasons why their case was different. All of them citing the previous records and explaining why the previous records did not apply to them. All of them lasting their 30 or 40 years, filing their reports, shifting gradually into the particular administrative register of a governance structure that has begun to suspect itself, and then going quiet. The Selvin were the 12th. Their record is the thinnest of the 18. They lasted only 19 years, the shortest tenure in the annexes, and their final report is 2 sentences. I know those sentences by heart. They read, "This administration has reached a determination that its continued presence in this sector is inconsistent with its administrative objectives. All operations will conclude by the end of the current reporting cycle." That is all. 2 sentences, and then the Selvin administrative reach was over, and 3 years after that the Selvin as a polity had dissolved entirely into a diaspora that their descendants are still navigating. The 2 sentences do not explain why the operations were inconsistent. They do not explain what happened between the previous quarterly report, which noted no irregularities, and those 2 sentences. They are the shortest conclusion in the annexes, and also, in a way I find difficult to articulate, the most honest. The Selvin came and noted that their presence was inconsistent with their objectives and left. They did not explain further. I have always respected them for that. I enter the shuttle. The commission observers secure the transport cases and run the departure checklist with the professional efficiency for which I selected them. Through the viewport, I can see the exterior of Vethanu Station's main hall, growing smaller as we lift. The clouded viewing ports catch the afternoon light for a moment as we rise, a brief illumination, like a building that is registering our departure. And then we are in the clouds, and then above them, and then the world is a curve below us, greening and quiet, and I look at it for as long as I can before it passes from the viewport. I have one task remaining before we reach the boundary marker. I need to close this dictation and record the final entry for the Doravan Compact's concluding annex, which I will transmit to the conclave as soon as we exit human-adjacent space. The final entry for a concluded annex follows a standard format, a statement of the annex's completion, a summary of the records collected, a formal classification of the occupation's outcome, and a closing certification. I know this format. I have written it 17 times. The classification field is giving me difficulty. The standard classifications available to me are administrative withdrawal, voluntary, administrative dissolution, involuntary, administrative dissolution, cause unspecified, dissolution by external military action, and dissolution by internal failure. I have used the first 3 across the 17 closed annexes in various proportions. The external military action classification has never been applied to an occupation annex. The internal failure classification has not been applied to any annex in the last 200 years. None of these classifications accurately describe what happened to the Doravan Compact. None of them accurately describe what happened to any of the 18. I compose the closing entry. I enter the header, the date, the collection summary, the exhibit list including Keyleth Asu's inscription as Exhibit D. I reach the classification field and I type Classification of occupation outcome. And I stop. The shuttle's engines hold their ready state. The observers are watching their instruments. The world that held 14 administrations and absorbed each of them is somewhere below the clouds. I think about what Keyleth Asu wrote. We were accommodated. I think about the Kelvari writing that the difference between their presence and their absence was, from the perspective of the administered populations, precisely nothing. I think about the Thurvin's 60% unaccounted for, and the Selvin's two-sentence conclusion, and the 17 final paragraphs that all end in the same quality of silence. Not the silence of defeat, not the silence of catastrophe, but the silence of something that was never quite a real thing coming to a close, like a performance at the end of which the audience was elsewhere all along. I think about what exists in that room below us, what was there before the compact, and before the Selving, and before all the others going back to the Thurving. What built the room and left it ready, as Keyleth Asu understood, for whoever came next, knowing that someone would always come next, knowing with the patience of something that measures time in the tenure of administrations rather than in years that there would always be someone who believed they were the exception, that they were different, that the record did not apply to them. What has been aware of me since the corridor? What acknowledged me as I left? I understand now that the acknowledgement was not a farewell. It was a notation. The same notation it made for Keyleth Asu when she climbed that corridor with her cases 43 days after her last report. The same notation it made for the Selvin administrator and the Vorith administrator and the 12 before them. Another one came. Another one is leaving. The notation is complete. The record continues. I close my dictation file. I open the final entry for Annex 14. I type the header, the date, the collection summary, the exhibit list. I type, classification of occupation outcome. The cursor blinks at the end of an unfinished sentence. The commission observers say nothing. They are professional. They have learned in the last several hours not to ask an archivist why they are pausing. I sit with the unfinished sentence for a long time. Long enough that we cross the boundary marker and exit human-adjacent space, and the observers quietly inform me of this, and I note it without moving. The conclave will receive the physical records. The data cores and the folio casings will be cataloged, and Annex 14 will be certified as complete. These things I can do and will do. The closed file, properly sealed, will sit alongside the other 17, and the occupation annexes will be complete for the first time in 112 years. The next curator who handles this division will inherit a clean collection, all 18 certified, all finished. I will not transmit the full recording I made in that building. Some of it will go into the file, the descriptions of the physical records, the photograph of the inscription, the survey data. What I observed in the corridor and in the room is not the kind of thing that belongs in the transmission record. Keyleth Asu understood this before I did. And she spent her last 42 days in that building making the same decision I am making now. Some observations do not belong in the forms. Some silences are the shape of something the conclave does not have a classification for, and the absence of a classification is not an invitation to invent one. The cursor blinks. I will pass this entry to my successor, when I retire, with a note that says only, "This one requires judgment," and my successor will read the annex and will sit with the same cursor and the same blinking and the same unfinished sentence and will make their own choice. They will understand, if they have done the work of reading the files the way I have read them, that the word after the dash is not missing, that I chose not to write it, that some words, once entered into a formal record, change the nature of what the conclave is willing to understand about the galaxy it administers. And they will make their own decision about whether the conclave is ready to understand it. I turn away from the entry. Through the forward viewport, the stars are the stars that the charts name and the maps claim, and the conclave has administered in its various capacities for 800 years. They are our stars in the sense that we have files on them, forms for them, classification fields that apply to them. They are orderly. They are knowable. They are the sky we are permitted to govern. Behind us, human space is what it has always been. And in a room beneath the surface of a world I will not return to, something old and steady and unhurried is aware that we have gone, and is not watching our departure, and is not waiting for our return, and is simply continuing as it has continued, as it will continue and will be there, and aware when the next one comes. There will be a next one, there always is. I do not look back.